The night was bright with city lights. Expensive cars lined up outside the biggest hotel in the city. Cameras flashed as well-dressed guests stepped out one after another. Inside, the ballroom looked like a dream. Crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, tables covered in white cloth and a soft golden glow that made everything shine. It was the night everyone had been waiting for, the Billionaire's annual charity gala. He was one of the richest men in the country. People admired his success, but many also whispered about his pride. He liked everything grand, his parties, his business deals, even his jokes. When he spoke, everyone laughed. When he entered a room, everyone turned to look. The charity gala wasn't just about helping others. It was also his way of reminding people how powerful he was. Every year he invited famous singers, dancers, and actors to perform. It was a show full of luxury and fame. But this year something unexpected appeared on the performance list. As his assistant read out the final schedule, one name made the billionaire raise an eyebrow. It wasn't a name anyone recognized. No fame, no background, no story attached. Just a simple name written in black ink. "Who is this?" he asked, tapping his finger on the paper. The assistant checked the file quickly. "Sir, she's a young woman from a small town. Someone from the charity team added her as a last-minute act. They said her singing touches hearts." The billionaire laughed. "Touches hearts? We're not running a village fair here. But you know what? Keep her. I could use some entertainment. Let's see how brave she is." The assistant hesitated. "Are you sure, sir? She's not trained for a crowd like this." "That's the point," he said with a grin. "People will get a laugh before the real show begins." He thought it would be funny. A small-town singer performing in front of rich guests. It would be something to talk about later. A story to make his friends laugh. But the assistant, who had seen how unpredictable life could be, said nothing. Sometimes fate has a strange way of humbling even the richest. The day of the event arrived. The ballroom was filled with the scent of flowers and the sound of clinking glasses. Laughter echoed as guests showed off their jewelry and designer clothes. The billionaire walked in wearing a black suit that probably cost more than most people's yearly salary. Cameras followed him as he smiled and waved. He loved this part, being admired, being seen. The show began with famous performers. A classical pianist played a stunning piece, followed by a dance troupe that dazzled everyone with bright costumes and perfect moves. Every act received polite applause. The billionaire sat in his seat satisfied. The night was going perfectly, just as planned. Then the host stepped up to the microphone and announced, "Next, we have a special performance from a young talent joining us tonight for the first time." The billionaire leaned back, smirking. "The mystery act," he whispered to the guest sitting beside him. "Get ready for something amusing." The crowd turned to look at the stage. A young woman stepped into the light. She wasn't wearing anything fancy, just a plain dress that looked out of place among all the glitter and silk. She held the microphone nervously, her hands trembling slightly. For a few seconds, she didn't speak. The crowd shifted in their seats. Some guests whispered. A few smiled mockingly. The billionaire crossed his legs and waited, expecting an awkward performance he could joke about later. Then the music started. It was soft at first, a slow melody played on a single guitar. The young woman closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to sing. The first few words came out gently, almost uncertain. But then her voice grew stronger. It wasn't polished like a pop star's, but it carried something no training could teach. Emotion. Real emotion. Each note was filled with life, with pain, with hope. The laughter in the room faded. The whispers stopped. People began to listen. Her song told a story. Of a worker who dreamed of a better life. Of a mother who never stopped believing. Of a daughter who learned that love could survive even the hardest days. Her words painted pictures that felt real. Every line carried weight. It was as if she wasn't performing. She was remembering. The billionaire felt something unusual in his chest. He wasn't sure what it was. Maybe guilt, maybe nostalgia, maybe something deeper. He had heard thousands of songs before, but this one was different. It wasn't meant to entertain. It was meant to be felt. The girl's voice filled every corner of the ballroom. Even the clinking of glasses stopped. Waiters froze where they stood. No one wanted to move. The billionaire leaned forward without realizing it. The emotion in her song reminded him of a time long ago. A time before money, before power, before pride had taken over his heart. When the last note echoed and faded away, the silence that followed felt heavy. The young woman stood there, breathing hard, looking uncertain. She had given everything in that performance, and then slowly someone began to clap. Then another person joined. And another. Within seconds, the entire room was filled with applause. Not polite, not forced, genuine applause. People stood up. Some even had tears in their eyes. The billionaire didn't clap at first. He was still lost in thought, caught between pride and realization. This wasn't what he expected. He had invited her for amusement, but she had given him something real, something money could never buy. He looked around and saw the faces of his guests. They weren't laughing anymore. They were moved, truly moved. The young woman gave a small smile and bowed her head before walking off the stage quietly. She didn't look for praise or attention. She looked relieved, as if she had said something she'd been holding inside for years. When the show continued with other performers, the energy felt different. The audience clapped, but their minds were still on that song. Even the billionaire couldn't focus. He kept hearing her voice, the emotion, the story behind those lyrics. He leaned toward his assistant. "Find out who she is," he said. "Right away, sir," the assistant replied, though he looked surprised. The billionaire rarely cared about anyone outside his circle, but this time was different. Something about that performance had touched him deeply, though he couldn't explain why. After the event ended and guests started leaving, the billionaire stayed behind for a while. The grand hall, once filled with laughter and chatter, was now quiet. The lights dimmed, and only the sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. He sat alone at his table, staring at the empty stage. He remembered how confident he'd been earlier, joking about the common girl. Now he felt small, almost foolish. Her voice had shown him something he had forgotten, that real talent and emotion have nothing to do with money or fame. As he left the ballroom and walked toward his car, her voice still played in his head. Every line of that song felt like it was meant for him. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story, something personal, something that connected their worlds in a way he didn't yet understand. Inside his car, he stared out the window at the city lights. For years, those lights had been a symbol of his success. Tonight, they looked different, distant, empty. He thought about the girl on that stage, singing with all her heart while he and others had come to laugh. He thought about the courage it took for her to stand there, facing hundreds of people who didn't believe in her. And most of all, he thought about the look in her eyes when she sang. Not anger, not pride, just truth. The billionaire closed his eyes and whispered to himself, "Who are you?" He didn't know yet that her song carried a message directly tied to his own past. He didn't know that her story and his were linked by something much deeper than coincidence. But he would soon find out. Because sometimes life has a way of putting us in front of the very truth we try to avoid. And this was only the beginning of that lesson. That night, while the world slept peacefully, one man who had everything couldn't sleep at all. He kept hearing her voice, soft but powerful, humble but fearless, echoing through the silence of his mansion. For the first time in years, the billionaire felt something money could never buy, the beginning of change. The billionaire couldn't sleep that night. He kept hearing that voice in his head, the softness, the pain, the truth behind every note. It was strange. He had listened to the best artists in the world, but none of them had made him feel the way that unknown girl did. He sat by the window of his large mansion, looking out at the city lights. They sparkled like jewels, but tonight they didn't shine the same way. Something inside him had changed. For years he had lived surrounded by luxury, by people who praised him for everything he did. But for the first time he felt small. That song had touched a part of him he didn't even know existed anymore. He leaned back in his chair thinking about her face, nervous but brave. He remembered how everyone laughed before she started, and how the same crowd had stood on their feet when she finished. That kind of honesty couldn't be bought. It came from real life, from experience, from struggle. The next morning, before his coffee even arrived, he called his assistant. "Did you find her?" he asked. "Yes, sir," the assistant replied. "Her name is on the list, but there's not much information. She's from a small town outside the city. No manager, no record label. Just a contact number. Call her," the billionaire said. The assistant looked surprised. "Sir, do you want me to invite her again?" "Just tell her I want to meet her," the billionaire said, his tone firm but quiet. A few hours later, he was sitting in his office when the assistant entered again. She said she'll come, sir. But she sounded unsure. He smiled slightly. I can imagine why. Later that day, his office was silent as she walked in. She looked different from the night before, calmer but still humble. She wore simple clothes and carried no fancy bag or jewelry. The billionaire stood up from behind his desk and gestured for her to sit. Thank you for coming, he said. She nodded politely. Her eyes lowered. You asked for me, sir. He noticed how careful her tone was, respectful but distant. She didn't seem nervous. She seemed guarded. I wanted to talk about your performance, he began. Your voice, it was powerful. You moved the entire room. She gave a small smile. I didn't think anyone would listen. They did, he said softly. Even I did. You have something special. You must have trained for years. She shook her head. No, I learned from life, not from teachers. I used to sing with my mother when I was little. She said music helps when words can't fix anything. Her words hit him harder than he expected. There was a silence between them. He couldn't help but ask, that song I'm the one you sang? It felt personal. Was it? She looked at him for the first time, straight in the eyes. Yes, it was. Who was it about? She hesitated, then said quietly, it was about people who work hard but are never seen, about those who give their best and still lose everything. The billionaire felt a strange heaviness in his chest. That's deep, she nodded. It's real. He leaned forward. You said your mother used to sing with you. What does she do now? Her expression changed. Her voice grew softer. She's not with me anymore. She worked in one of your factories years ago when before it closed. The words hit him like a storm. He froze. My factory? Yes, she said calmly. The textile one in the industrial area. My mother worked there for 5 years. When it shut down, the workers didn't get their last few months' salaries. She waited and waited, but nothing came. We lost everything after that. The billionaire's throat went dry. He remembered that factory. It was one of his early investments, a project that failed because of poor management. He had moved on easily back then, not even thinking about the workers. But now, sitting in front of this young woman, he saw the human side of that failure for the first time. He looked at her and said quietly, I didn't know. She gave a faint smile. People like us never expect you to know, sir. For us, it was just another closed door. There was no anger in her tone, no accusation, just truth. That made it even harder for him to bear. He took a deep breath. And that's why you sang that song? Yes, she replied. I wanted people like you to hear what it feels like when someone's decisions change the lives of hundreds. I didn't expect you to call me, but I'm glad you did. Maybe you understand now why I had to sing it. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. For years he had been surrounded by people who only told him what he wanted to hear. This girl, this simple, fearless girl, had spoken the truth without fear. He looked at her again and said quietly, I don't know how to make up for what happened, but I want to try. She shook her head. You don't have to do anything for me. Just don't forget that behind every business decision, there are people who depend on it. That's all I wanted you to hear. He stared at her, humbled. You have more courage than most people I know. She stood up slowly. Courage isn't a choice, sir. Sometimes life gives you no other option. As she walked toward the door, he called out, Wait. She turned back. He said, If I could help in any way, would you let me? She thought for a moment, then smiled gently. If you really want to help, don't help me. Help those who still wait for their chance. And with that, she left. The billionaire sat in silence long after she was gone. Her words played in his mind again and again. Behind every business decision, there are people. That night, he didn't go to a party or a meeting. Instead, he sat in his office looking through old files. He asked his team to pull out the records from that closed factory, the names of every worker who had lost their wages. His employees looked confused but obeyed. He stayed up reading those names, and hundreds of them. Some of the files were so old that the ink had started to fade. Each name told a story. People who had once worked for him, who had built part of his success, and who had been forgotten when the doors closed. The next morning, he made a decision. He called a meeting with his managers and accountants. I want every unpaid worker from that factory compensated, he said. Find them or their families. I don't care how long it takes or how much it costs. The managers exchanged surprised looks. Sir, that's a huge amount. Those cases were closed years ago. Then open them again, he interrupted. His tone was calm but firm. It's time I fixed something that should have been fixed long ago. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about conscience. Days turned into weeks. The Billionaire's team worked hard to locate the former workers and their families. Many were shocked when they received the payments. Some cried. Some didn't even believe it was real. Word began to spread quietly about what he had done. He didn't want publicity. He refused interviews and kept his name out of it. He didn't do it to look kind. He did it because he finally understood what kindness really meant. Every night as he sat in his quiet mansion, he thought of that young woman and her mother's song. It had opened his eyes to something his wealth had blinded him to: humanity. One evening, his assistant entered his office and said, "Sir, the girl you met, she's performing again next week at a small cafe downtown." The billionaire paused for a moment, then smiled softly. "Book me a table. No VIP section, just a regular seat." The night of the performance arrived. The cafe was small but warm, filled with real people, students, workers, families. The billionaire sat quietly in a corner, unnoticed. When she walked on stage, her eyes scanned the crowd. For a brief second, they met his. He didn't say a word, but she smiled, a quiet smile of understanding. As she began to sing again, her voice carried the same power as before, maybe even more. This time, though, the billionaire wasn't watching from a throne. He was just another listener in the crowd, grateful for the second chance life had given him to understand what truly mattered. And as her voice filled the air once again, he realized something profound. She hadn't just given him a performance that night. She had given him purpose. The billionaire couldn't sleep that night. The sound of her voice kept echoing in his head like a haunting melody that wouldn't fade away. It wasn't just the song, it was the emotion behind it. There was truth, pain, and power in every note, something he hadn't felt in years. For a man who had everything, it was strange how something so simple could stir up feelings he didn't even know were still inside him. The next morning, he sat in his large office, staring out the window at the city below. His assistant quietly entered, holding a stack of reports, but he wasn't listening. He was lost in thought. He finally turned to her and said, "Find that girl who sang last night. I want to meet her." His assistant looked surprised but nodded quickly. A few hours later, the young woman was brought to his office. She seemed nervous but calm, standing there in her modest clothes, holding her small purse tightly in her hands. The billionaire gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing. "That was quite a performance last night," he said slowly. "You have a powerful voice." She smiled faintly. "Thank you, sir. I just sang what I felt." Her words carried more weight than he expected. There was something real in her simplicity, something that made him uncomfortable. He leaned forward and asked, "What made you choose that song? It wasn't exactly cheerful." She looked down for a moment, gathering her thoughts, then said, "It's not just a song. It's a story, my story, and my mother's." The room grew quiet. He felt something shift in the air, something that made his chest tighten slightly. She continued, "Years ago, my mother worked in one of your factories. She worked day and night, believing that the company would take care of her. But one day the factory was closed without warning. She never got her last salary. We lost everything after that." Her voice didn't shake. It wasn't angry, it was steady, calm, almost too calm. That calmness hit him harder than any accusation could have. He leaned back slowly, the memories returning to him. He vaguely remembered the factory she was talking about. At that time, it was just a small business deal that didn't go as planned. Numbers on a file, signatures on paper. He never thought about the lives affected behind those numbers. "I didn't know," he whispered, though even as he said it, he wasn't sure if it was true. Maybe he didn't want to know. Maybe it was easier not to think about the people who lost their jobs while he gained another property, another car, another piece of art for his wall. The young woman looked up, her eyes steady but kind. "I didn't come here for revenge or sympathy," she said softly. "Last night I just wanted someone to hear her story. She never got justice, but I wanted the world to know she existed, that her struggle mattered." He couldn't speak for a moment. The silence in the room felt heavy, almost sacred. It wasn't about wealth or status anymore. It was about humanity, about the invisible gap between the powerful and the powerless that people rarely see until someone dares to sing about it. After a long pause, he said quietly, "I owe your mother an apology." She smiled sadly. "You owe her peace," she replied. Those simple words pierced through his heart like truth itself. When she left his office, he sat there for a long time, replaying every word. He realized how blind he had been, living in luxury while others paid the price for his success. The applause he once craved suddenly felt meaningless. That night he walked through his mansion, looking at the expensive paintings and sculptures that once made him feel proud. Now they just looked empty, beautiful but lifeless. He walked into his private music room where a grand piano stood untouched for years. He sat down and tried to play, but his hands trembled. The notes didn't sound the same anymore. They lacked soul. He realized the difference between talent and truth. That girl had truth, and that's why her performance would be remembered long after the lights went out. Days passed, but her words stayed with him. He found himself reading old reports from the factory she mentioned. He saw the list of workers, their wages, their names, and then he saw her mother's name. A wave of guilt hit him. She had worked for almost 10 years without missing a single day. And yet when the factory shut down, she received nothing. He closed the file slowly, feeling something he hadn't felt in decades: remorse. For the first time, he thought about how many lives were connected to his decisions. How many people lost their homes because of a deal he made from a comfortable chair. He had always thought of himself as a successful businessman, but now he wondered if success meant anything without conscience. One evening, he attended a small community event in the same town where that factory once stood. The roads were old, the buildings simple, but the people's eyes carried stories of struggle, hope, and silent endurance. He didn't announce who he was. He just listened. He heard people talking about how hard life had been after the factory closed. Some were still trying to find stable jobs. Some had left town completely. He went back home that night feeling heavier but also clearer. He knew what he had to do. The next morning he called his legal team and said, "I want every unpaid worker from that factory located. I don't care how long it takes, I want them compensated in full. Every single one." His team was shocked but obeyed. Meanwhile, he couldn't stop thinking about the girl who had unknowingly changed his life. Her voice had not only moved him, it had awakened something inside him. For years, he had believed that wealth gave him control over everything, but in a few minutes on stage she showed him that true power lies in honesty and emotion. As he began the process of righting his past mistakes, word slowly spread that the billionaire was changing. People thought it was just another PR stunt, but those close to him saw the difference. He had stopped attending lavish parties. He spent more time visiting local communities, quietly listening, learning, and helping. Deep down, he knew it would never erase the pain he had caused, but it was a start. Every night he would sit by his window, remembering her song, the one that began as a performance and turned into a mirror reflecting his own soul. He decided he wanted to see her again, not as a businessman and performer, but as two people who shared something real. He wanted to thank her, not for her voice, but for her courage. Because sometimes it takes a stranger to remind a powerful man of his forgotten humanity. And as he prepared to meet her again, he realized something profound. The richest man in the room isn't the one with the most money, but the one who still has a heart capable of feeling, and she had helped him find his again. Weeks passed after the billionaire met the young woman, but her words stayed in his mind like a permanent echo. Every time he tried to distract himself with meetings, parties, or business calls, that song would find its way back into his thoughts. It wasn't just a melody anymore, it was a reminder, a mirror of who he had been and who he could still become. He had made the decision to repay all the unpaid workers from his old factory, and his team had already begun tracking them down. It wasn't easy. Many had moved away, some had passed on, and others had lost hope that anyone would ever remember them. But he didn't give up. For the first time in years, he wasn't driven by profit or power. He was driven by guilt, yes, but also by something purer: empathy. Every morning he would call his office personally to check the progress. "How many have we found today?" he would ask. When his assistant told him the numbers, he didn't just nod and hang up. He wanted to know their stories, what had happened to them after losing their jobs, how they had survived, and if they were doing all right now. The more he learned, the more he realized how disconnected he had been from real life. He had built his empire on numbers and charts, but behind those numbers were faces, people who had dreams, families, and pain. That realization began to change him. Slowly, the man who once cared only about his reputation started caring about his responsibility. One afternoon, he received an envelope. Inside were photos and letters from some of the workers who had received their long overdue payments. Some wrote short thank you notes, others drew pictures of their children smiling again, and one woman simply wrote, "You gave me peace before I leave this world." Those words broke something inside him. He felt a lump in his throat and tears in his eyes, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. That same evening, he looked at the photo of the young woman, the singer who had unknowingly changed his life. He wanted to meet her again, but this time not as a powerful man offering an opportunity, but as a human being saying thank you. He found out she was performing at a small local theater for charity. It wasn't a grand event like his galas, but a simple stage where people gathered out of love for art, not status. He decided to go quietly without cameras or reporters. He sat in the corner seat, blending into the crowd. When the lights dimmed and she walked onto the stage, he felt the same quiet energy he had felt the first time she sang. She greeted the audience with a humble smile and said, "Tonight I want to sing for those who were forgotten but never gave up." Her voice filled the hall once again, gentle yet powerful, pure yet deep. This time her song was different. It wasn't heavy with pain. It was filled with hope. It spoke about forgiveness, about how even broken people can heal when someone chooses to care. The billionaire felt his heart swell. It was like listening to the sound of redemption. He realized she wasn't just singing for herself anymore. She was singing for everyone who had been hurt and for everyone who had finally learned to make things right. After the show, he quietly approached her backstage. When she saw him, she looked surprised but calm. "You came," she said softly. "I had to," he replied. "I wanted to tell you that I did what I promised. Every worker from that factory has been paid. Some even started new businesses with the money." Her eyes brightened, and for a moment she didn't know what to say. That's wonderful," she finally whispered. He nodded. "No, it's what should have been done years ago. I can't change the past, but I can choose what kind of man I'll be from now on. And I owe that realization to you." She smiled gently, her eyes glistening. "Sometimes all it takes is one song to remind someone of what really matters," she said. He took a deep breath and said, "You didn't just remind me, you changed me. I want to do something more. I want to start a foundation in your mother's name, to help people who lost their jobs or never got their fair share. Will you help me lead it?" She froze for a moment, overwhelmed. "You'd do that?" she asked. "Yes," he said simply. "I can't undo what happened, but maybe together we can stop it from happening to others." The sincerity in his voice was real. It wasn't the polished charm of a billionaire trying to fix his image. It was a man who had finally found his conscience. She nodded slowly, a tear sliding down her cheek, and said, "I'll help you." Over the next few months, they worked together. The foundation began helping struggling workers and artists across the country. It became known for giving second chances to people who were forgotten or overlooked. The billionaire didn't seek media attention this time. He didn't stand in front of cameras or give long speeches. He quietly did the work, visiting small towns, listening to people's stories and writing checks without expecting anything in return. But the biggest transformation wasn't in the foundation. It was in him. His mansion no longer felt like a symbol of pride, but a place of reflection. He started spending his evenings playing soft music on his old piano, not for performance, but for peace. He began to understand that success without compassion is just noise. A year later, he hosted another charity gala. This time, it wasn't filled with celebrities or expensive decorations. It was simple and meaningful. The people he invited were workers, artists, and families who had benefited from the foundation. And at the center of the event was the young woman who had inspired it all. When she walked onto the stage, the audience stood up and clapped before she even sang a single note. The billionaire stood too, not as her superior, but as someone who respected her deeply. He walked to the microphone and said, "Last year I thought I was inviting entertainment, but what I received that night was truth, a truth that changed me. She reminded me that money may build walls, but honesty breaks them down. Tonight I want to thank her for giving me back my heart." The crowd fell silent for a moment, touched by his words. Then the applause returned, louder than before. The young woman smiled humbly and began to sing again. This time her voice carried joy. It was no longer the song of struggle, but of healing. The billionaire stood among the crowd, not above them. He didn't see himself as a savior anymore, but as someone who had been saved. In her voice he found redemption. In her story he found purpose. When the song ended, he looked around the hall. People were smiling, some crying softly, but all feeling the same warmth that filled the air. For the first time in a long time, he felt something priceless: peace. After the event, he stood by the window, watching the night sky. The city lights below shimmered like tiny stars, and he thought about how much had changed in a single year. He wasn't the same man who laughed at a stranger's name on a guest list. That man had disappeared the moment a brave young woman dared to sing the truth. And as he closed his eyes, he realized the greatest wealth in life isn't what you own. It's what you feel when you finally do the right thing. The billionaire had expected a joke that night long ago, but instead she had given him the performance of a lifetime, one that didn't end with applause but with transformation, and that performance would live in his heart forever.